The studio lights of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert shone brightly as Karoline Leavitt walked onto the stage. The former Trump White House official turned campaign spokesperson moved confidently in her tailored navy suit, smiling as she shook Colbert's hand and took her seat. The studio audience offered polite applause, though scattered murmurs suggested a predominantly liberal crowd. Uncertain about this conservative guest, Colbert leaned forward in his chair, his trademark smirk already forming. The late-night host had built his reputation on sharp political commentary that often skewered conservative figures, and tonight would prove no exception after a few perfunctory questions about Leavitt's background. Colbert's tone suddenly shifted. "So, Karoline," he said, emphasizing her name with a hint of condescension, "you've gone from being the youngest White House press assistant to defending policies that most people your age strongly oppose. Is it difficult being the token Gen Z voice?" For outdated ideas, the audience erupted in laughter and applause. Colbert's question wasn't just pointed. It was deliberately belittling, reducing Leavitt to nothing more than an age demographic, and implying her positions weren't authentically held. The camera caught his self-satisfied expression as he waited for her to fumble through an uncomfortable response. But Leavitt didn't flinch. She straightened almost imperceptibly in her chair. Her expression composed. What happened next would not only silence the studio audience, but would transform the entire interview into a moment that would go viral across America, for reasons Colbert never anticipated. Before we reveal Karoline Leavitt's response, that left Colbert utterly speechless comment. Where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next political confrontation breakdown. Stephen Colbert had reigned as a late-night television giant for years. The host of CBS's flagship The Late Show had built his brand on political satire with an unmistakably progressive bent at 60. Colbert represented an established media elite, Ivy League, educated, celebrated by critics, and comfortable in his position of cultural influence. His interviews with conservative guests typically followed a predictable pattern: withering sarcasm, audience laughter at the guest's expense, and viral clips that would circulate the next day, showing another right-wing figure supposedly destroyed on national television, the studio. That night was Colbert's domain. The blue backdrop featured his name in lights. The audience was primed to laugh at his jokes and applaud his points. The band, the cameras, the production team, all elements of an environment designed to give the host every advantage in controlling the narrative. Colbert's questions weren't spontaneous, but carefully crafted by a team of writers to create precisely the awkward moments and gotcha clips that drove social media engagement. Karoline Leavitt, at just 28, represented a new generation of conservative communicators after serving as an assistant press secretary in the Trump White House at only 23, making her one of the youngest White House staffers in history. She had risen through Republican ranks. With remarkable speed, her current role as a senior spokesperson for a major conservative campaign had put her increasingly in the national spotlight. Though this was her first appearance on a late-night comedy program, unlike many conservative guests who appeared on these shows defensively or uncomfortably, Leavitt had accepted the invitation strategically before entering politics. She had worked briefly in television news, giving her an understanding of media dynamics that many of her peers lacked. She had prepared extensively for this appearance, anticipating the likely lines of attack and researching Colbert's interview patterns with previous conservative guests. The stakes of this confrontation extended beyond personal reputations. For Kula, these exchanges with conservative figures drove ratings and reinforced his standing with his progressive audience. For Leavitt, this represented an opportunity to break through the media filter and demonstrate that young conservatives could effectively communicate their principles even in hostile territory. The tension in their exchange reflected broader cultural divides in America between traditional media gatekeepers and emerging voices between established political frameworks. And new generational perspectives, what might appear as simply another late-night interview, actually represented a microcosm of the larger struggles reshaping American political discourse as Colbert delivered his insulting question about Leavitt. Being a token Gen Z voice for outdated ideas, the audience's laughter reinforced the power imbalance he sought to establish. The host leaned back, slightly, satisfaction evident in his posture. He had delivered variations of this same question, too. Countless conservative guests typically forcing them into defensive, flustered responses that only dug them deeper into uncomfortable territory. But in the brief moment before Leavitt responded, keen observers might have noticed something unexpected. In her eyes, not intimidation, but a focused intensity, suggesting she had anticipated this exact moment and was prepared to transform it. "That's an interesting framing," Stephen Leavitt responded, her voice steady and composed. "But I have to wonder if reducing people to their demographic categories is really as progressive as you think it is." Her response, polite but pointed, caught Colbert slightly off guard. He had expected defensiveness, perhaps even irritation. But Leavitt's calm challenge to his premise created an unexpected dynamic. "Well, I'm just noting the contradiction," Colbert pressed. "Recovering quickly, young people overwhelmingly reject the policies you advocate. Doesn't that make you question whether you're on the wrong side of history?" The audience applauded his follow-up, but with noticeably less enthusiasm than before. Leavitt maintained direct eye contact with Colbert, unrattled by the crowd's reaction. "Actually, Stephen, young people are far more diverse in their thinking than media stereotypes suggest." She countered the assumption that all young adults must think identically seems particularly limiting, almost as if we're not allowed. Independent thought. Colbert shifted in his chair slightly. The exchange wasn't following the usual pattern where the conservative guest becomes flustered or defensive. "Independent thought is great," Colbert said, his tone becoming more pointed. "But supporting policies that work against your own generation's interests seems less like independence and more like confusion. Climate change, healthcare, student debt. These are real issues affecting young people." This was his attempt to steer the conversation back to familiar territory, listing policy positions his audience opposed and painting "leave" it as either misguided or malicious for not sharing their views. It was a tactic he had employed successfully with numerous guests. But Leavitt was prepared. "I'm glad you brought up issues affecting young Americans," she said, "but I think what's often missing from these conversations is the recognition that young people can examine the same problems and reach different conclusions about solutions." She leaned forward slightly. "For example, when I talk with other young Americans about the $34 trillion national debt, many are deeply concerned about what that means for our future. When we discuss how inflation has increased the cost of basic necessities by 20% in recent years, that resonates with people trying to make ends meet. These economic realities affect my generation profoundly." The studio had grown quieter. Leavitt wasn't playing defense. She was articulating a perspective rarely heard in this environment. Colbert sensed the shift and moved to regain control. "Let's talk about your time in the Trump White House," he interjected, abruptly changing subjects. "You've defended some pretty controversial statements and policies as someone who supposedly values truth. How did you justify working for an administration with such a complicated relationship with facts?" His tone had hardened, and the question drew supportive murmurs from the audience. This was a familiar avenue of attack, associating a guest with the most controversial aspects of their political affiliation and forcing them to either defend the indefensible or disavow their connections. Leavitt nodded slightly, as if she had anticipated this exact pivot. I understand why you're asking that Stephen media coverage often reduces complex situations to simplistic narratives. She maintained a respectful tone. While subtly calling attention to the framing of his question, what I found working in the White House was that the reality was far more nuanced than what most Americans saw through media filters. Policy discussions, their implementation, and their communication involve complex processes that rarely translate to sound bites or tweets. Colbert tried to interrupt, but Leavitt continued calmly. I'm not asking anyone to agree with every position or statement. What I would suggest, though, is that dismissing the legitimate concerns of the 74 million Americans who voted differently than you might not be the path to understanding our divided country. The atmosphere in the studio had transformed. This wasn't the easy, one-sided exchange Colbert had anticipated. The audience seemed unsure how to react. The expected laughs at the conservative guests' expense weren't materializing. Instead, they were witnessing a measured conversation, where Leavitt consistently redirected Colbert's attempts at gotcha moments. Sensing the shift, Colbert employed his most direct approach, yet, "Let's be clear, though," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "You're part of a movement that many see as fundamentally threatening democracy itself. How do you justify aligning yourself with that, especially as a young woman who would presumably value rights that many conservatives seem eager to restrict?" It was the most provocative question, yet essentially asking Leavitt to defend herself against accusations of supporting authoritarianism and misogyny. The audience tensed, anticipating either an explosive response or a damaging admission. Leavitt took a deliberate breath, her expression remaining composed despite the severity of the allegations embedded in Colbert's question. The tension in the studio built during this brief pause, setting the stage for the exchange that would transform the entire interview. Stephen Leavitt began, her voice calm, but carrying a new intensity. "I've noticed something interesting about our conversation tonight. You've asked me to justify my existence as a young conservative woman, to explain why I don't conform to your expectations of how someone my age or gender should think, and to defend myself against characterizations that don't reflect my actual beliefs." She maintained perfect eye contact with Colbert, whose smirk had faded. "But I haven't heard you ask me a single substantive question about specific policies or solutions. The assumption seems to be that my views couldn't possibly be formed through thoughtful analysis. They must instead be the result of confusion or bad character." The studio had fallen completely silent. Even Colbert's typically responsive audience seemed captivated by this unexpected turn. What if, instead of questioning my legitimacy as a young conservative woman, we discussed the actual merits of different approaches to the challenges facing Americans? Leavitt continued. "Because when we reduce people to demographic boxes and assume they must think a certain way based on their age, gender, or race, aren't we engaging in exactly the kind of prejudice that progressivism claims to oppose?" Colbert shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the dynamic had completely inverted. What began as his attempt to dismiss Leavitt had transformed into her methodically exposing the contradictions. In his approach, "Look, I'm simply pointing out," he began, but Leavitt respectfully continued. "I understand, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation," she said, "but I think your viewers deserve more than predetermined narratives about people with different viewpoints. When you frame conservatives, particularly young conservatives, as either calculating villains or confused victims, you're not encouraging the substantive dialogue that might actually bridge some of our divisions." She smiled slightly. "I didn't come here expecting us to agree on policy, but I did hope we might demonstrate that people with different perspectives can engage respectfully without questioning each other's basic humanity or right to independent." Thought the camera caught Colbert's expression, a mixture of surprise and recognition. The host, known for his quick wit and verbal agility, found himself momentarily speechless. The planned trajectory of making Leavitt look foolish had backfired completely. Instead, she had calmly highlighted how his approach to the interview reflected the very intolerance and stereotyping that his progressive viewpoint supposedly rejected. That's a fair point. Colbert finally acknowledged his tone markedly different. So let me ask you directly. Then, what specific policies do you think would most benefit young Americans? Right now, the audience, sensing the authentic shift in the conversation, offered spontaneous applause, not for a cutting joke at the guest's expense, but for a genuine moment of recognition and reset. For the next 7 minutes, something remarkable happened. On The Late Show, Leavitt outlined her perspective on economic policies, education reform, and international relations with a clarity and nuance rarely seen in such environments. Colbert, adapting to the unexpected situation, engaged with her points substantively rather than dismissively. It wasn't that they suddenly agreed, their fundamental political differences remained, but the nature of the exchange had transformed from attempted public humiliation to actual dialogue. Viewers witnessed something that had become increasingly rare in American political discourse. Two people with opposing viewpoints having a respectful, substantive conversation as the segment concluded. And Colbert turned to the camera to announce a commercial break. Both host and guest knew that something unexpected had transpired. What was planned as another predictable conservative gets-owned clip for social media had instead become a moment that challenged the very format of political dialogue on late-night television. Within hours of the broadcast, clips of the exchange flooded social media, but not the clips CBS producers had anticipated. Instead of Colbert destroying another conservative guest, the segments going viral showed Leavitt's measured responses that flipped the script on the host. The hashtag #Leavitt Lectures. Colbert began trending with viewers from across the political spectrum. Commenting on the unexpected dynamic, "I'm no conservative," wrote one Twitter user with over 50,000 followers, but watching someone call out the lazy demographic assumptions without getting angry or defensive was actually refreshing. Another commented, "Didn't expect to see actual dialogue breakout on late-night TV. More of this, please." Media coverage the following morning reflected the unusual nature of the exchange. The New York Times ran an analysis titled, "When Late-Night Gotcha Moments Backfire," examining how Leavitt had redirected Colbert's attempted dismissal into a more substantive conversation conservative outlets celebrated. What they viewed as a rare moment of their perspective breaking through on mainstream entertainment programming. What Leavitt demonstrated, wrote a columnist in The Atlantic, wasn't just composure under pressure, but a challenge to the format itself, questioning whether reducing complex political differences to snarky punchlines serves any purpose beyond reinforcing existing divisions. CBS's digital team initially planning to release short clips of Colbert's sharpest jabs, instead published the entire 12-minute segment unedited on their YouTube channel. The video accumulated over 5 million views within 48 hours, with the comment section reflecting surprised reactions from viewers of various political persuasions for Colbert personally. The aftermath was complex. His longtime fans defended him online, but behind the scenes, the host reportedly convened a meeting with his writing staff to discuss the interview, according to production sources. Colbert acknowledged that the exchange had revealed certain limitations in their approach to political guests. "We've gotten too comfortable with the formula," he allegedly told his team. Maybe there's something to be said for engaging with the substance of different perspectives, rather than just going for the easy laugh. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes appeared in Colbert's interview style. While maintaining his progressive viewpoint, he began asking more substantive questions of political guests from both parties, allowing for more complete responses before jumping to jokes. Several media critics noted the shift, with one writing, "Post Leavitt There's a perceptible difference in how Colbert approaches political dialogue, less dismissive, more engaged with actual ideas. For Karoline Leavitt, the appearance generated significant professional momentum, requests for interviews flooded. From news programs and podcasts across the political spectrum, conservative organizations sought her for speaking engagements. Impressed by her ability to effectively communicate in hostile territory without resorting to anger or defensiveness. What made Leavitt's approach effective, explained a political communications professor in a widely shared analysis, wasn't that she destroyed Colbert or owned the libs, it was that she refused to accept the framing that would have marginalized her. Instead, redirecting toward substantive discussion while maintaining perfect composure, young conservatives particularly celebrated Leavitt's performance campus. Republican groups reported increased interest following the interview, with many young conservatives citing Leavitt as an example of how to engage effectively in environments where their views were unwelcome. She showed you don't have to choose between standing your ground and being respectful, noted the president of a college Republican organization beyond individual careers. The Colbert-Leavitt exchange sparked broader discussions about the state of political discourse in American entertainment. Several late-night hosts found themselves facing questions from journalists about whether the comedy political format had become too one-sided and predictable. Have these shows become echo chambers, asked the media critic in Variety, when the other formula is so established that guests can anticipate and counter it? Perhaps it's time to reconsider whether the approach serves viewers or merely reinforces what they already believe. 6 months after the interview, its impact was still evident. Leavitt, whose national profile had risen significantly, returned to The Late Show this time for a segment specifically designed as a point-counterpoint discussion on economic policy. The format was notably different, less focused on gotcha moments, more on contrasting perspectives. The audience, while still clearly aligned with Colbert's views, responded with attentive listening rather than automatic derision at a media conference. Later that year, Leavitt reflected on the original interview. What happened that night wasn't about winning an exchange. She explained, it was about demonstrating that political differences don't have to be approached through stereotypes and dismissals. We can disagree even strongly while still recognizing each other's humanity and capacity for thoughtful positions. A senior producer from The Late Show, speaking anonymously to The Hollywood Reporter, offered a behind-the-scenes perspective. That interview changed conversations in our production meetings. We realized we'd fallen into patterns that might get easy laughs, but weren't actually advancing meaningful dialogue. There's still plenty of room for sharp political comedy, but perhaps not at the expense of substantive exchange. The Colbert-Leavitt moment ultimately transcended the individuals involved. To become a case study in political communication, how preparation, composure, and a refusal to accept reductive framing could transform even the most predictably hostile environments. Communication professors began including the interview in their curriculum, analyzing how Leavitt had redirected the conversation without antagonism or defensiveness for everyday Americans watching the political landscape. The exchange offered a glimpse of what political discourse might look like beyond the predictable. Patterns of outrage and dismissal, a model where differing perspectives could be expressed without either side questioning the other's basic legitimacy or right to participate. This confrontation between Stephen Colbert and Karoline Leavitt reminds us that the most powerful response to attempts at dismissal isn't anger or defensiveness, but calm persistence in redirecting toward substance. When faced with questions about her legitimacy as a young conservative woman, Leavitt didn't take the bait of outrage or resentment. Instead, she methodically highlighted the contradictions in Colbert's approach while maintaining perfect composure and respect. The lesson extends beyond politics to any situation where one's fundamental right to hold a perspective is questioned rather than engaged with on its merits. True confidence doesn't require matching dismissal with dismissal or insult with insult. It's demonstrated through the calm certainty that one's ideas can withstand substantive examination. If you found this analysis valuable, please like and subscribe to our channel for more breakdowns of the pivotal political and cultural exchanges shaping America's discourse. Comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Leavitt's approach changed how Colbert conducts interviews, and which political confrontation would you like us to analyze next? Until our next video, remember that in an age of shouting, sometimes the most revolutionary act is calm, substantive dialogue. Chani ba trisi hi bain forward.